Halloween, the perfect holiday of the year for Batman and his rogue gallery of villains. And it was actually kind of bewildering that Rocksteady had not tackled that specific holiday throughout the entire tenure of their handling of the Arkham series. Because Asylum and City didn't necessarily take a place around any specific timeline. I think maybe Halloween was kind of touched upon in City, and we definitely tackled Christmas out of all holidays for Arkham Origins, but that was technically Warner Bros. Montreal. So to cap off their trilogy and bring things to a very climactic close, Rocksteady decided to take on Halloween for Batman Arkham Knight, which is celebrating its 10-year anniversary this year. And even though it was unfortunately missed out on the actual 10-year anniversary back in June, I thought to myself, well, I think the next best time period to release this 10-year retrospective would be Halloween. But that's one of the things to kind of look back on as I did, I want to say, playthrough number 3 of Batman Arkham Knight on the PlayStation 5. Because frankly, I did not have a choice. I do technically have Batman Arkham Knight on PC, and I have to kind of provide a little bit of a disclosure here that my intention was to run Arkham Knight at one of its cleanest ways possible, which is to do maybe not 4K, but at least do 2K 60 FPS with cool volumetric lighting, the rain effects, texture work, all the jazz that really makes Batman Arkham Knight perform at its peak. Unfortunately, 10 years later, and this game still cannot run at peak on PC for some godforsaken reason. I can run the game if I'm just playing it, but of course, me being a content creator and me trying to do a 10-year retrospective, trying to play the game and also capture the footage is a completely different matter, and unfortunately my PC was not able to handle it. I'm at a point where I frankly need a separate PC to capture the footage and then another one to run the goddamn game. So that was not necessarily going to be the case, and I had to resort, after much deliberation, different methods that I had to look up online, quick fixes, debugs, etc. I could not get Batman Arkham Knight to run on PC for the life of me. So I had to resort to PlayStation 5, and the reason for why I was trying to hold myself from resorting to running it on PlayStation 5/4. And the reason for why I was trying to keep myself to resorting to playing on the PlayStation 5 is because technically it is not a PlayStation 5 version. It is still technically the PS4 version running on PS5, because to this day, we still don't have a next-gen drop for Arkham Knight. Means that it's still going to be running at, I don't think it's even running at 1080p. I think it's like 900p, since it's looking a little bit on the blurry side from occasion to occasion. And then most notably, it's running at 30 FPS. But it's possible that maybe by accident, that might have been a good thing, because that's probably the first thing that I was able to note while running through this third playthrough of Batman Arkham Knight 10 years past its release date, was that even after 10 years, even at 30 frames per second, 1080p, or even subpar to 1080p, maybe even 900p. I think it's Xbox that runs it at 900p, and PlayStation still manages to at least target HD, full HD resolution, but not even quite 2K, let alone 4K, is the fact that I'm able to digest those slight handicaps, those technical handicaps on current gen hardware, no less, because Batman Arkham Knight, after 10 years, still looks f***ing amazing. As cliche as it's become, Batman Arkham Knight truly does put so many modern games in this current generation of gaming to shame. There's so many games that are coming out recently from AAA developers that boast about delivering a quadruple game experience, and it tickles me pink to note so many YouTubers, so many different publishing outlets still utilizing Batman Arkham Knight as a good kind of like set standard for what you can achieve on a visual level on console. And this is a game that came out 10 years ago. Do you know how shameful that is? And here I am running the gamut once again 10 years afterwards on my third playthrough, and Gotham still looks amazing. You got the constant rain effects, you got the neon lights, but overall, it's got this taste, it's got this vibe gliding through the city, or rather riding it on the Batmobile, that I can still feel the very cold and damp air of the atmosphere within Gotham City on my face by simply just sitting here with the controller in my hand and just looking at a screen. I can still feel that atmosphere. I can still feel the air and the actual weather effects. I can still be enthralled by the cinematography of just kind of standing on a rooftop, cycling the camera around with the right analog stick, and just looking at the way that everything is just designed with this sort of fusion between modern architecture and then this sort of Art Deco style that we kind of lifted a little bit from the prior two Arkham games, and just running with it continuously more here in Batman Arkham Knight. Something that is illustrated very well with its opening sequence taking place in that diner that is then sabotaged by Scarecrow, where you have like refrigerators and the decor of that diner just in and of itself modeled after a 1950s diner, while at the same time having, like I said, little things picked up here and there that are much more modernized in terms of like the way that people are dressed, the way that people are talking, and it's going for its very specific approach to this visual design that I still cannot take away from Rocksteady tackling here with that revamped version of the engine, bringing it to that, at the time, much more modern hardware in the form of PS4 and Xbox One, I believe, and leaving the last generation of PS3 and 360 behind with Arkham City. You can definitely tell exactly what areas that they were trying to cook on a technical level. And you can maybe argue that the game does do that a little bit to a fault, to where it leans a little bit towards technical demo happenstances. I did find a couple of patches here in my playthrough this time around, 10 years looking on, where it does feel like the game is trying to flex its muscles as far as what it's doing on a technical level in terms of lighting, in terms of effects with real-time stuff. Like every time Batman walks into a room, it doesn't fade out or fade in and cut to black or anything like that. It actually just has him walking through the building and the building gets fully realized. That's commendable. But then there's other areas where a little bit of the novelty from the prior two Arkham games gets a little bit missed. I'm not saying that I wish they could have brought it back, but it just had its own flavor that you can tell is being exchanged for technical prowess in Arkham Knight. And the reason for why I'm nitpicking that somewhat is because even after enjoying this new playthrough, there was a part of me that kind of missed different sort of atmospheric effects that were happening in Arkham Asylum and Arkham City, to the point where I kind of wish that I would have been able to toggle the rain effects off and on, kind of change the lighting, change the weather, especially when we get to like the cloudburst moment and the cinematography changes in the very orangey direction. I kind of wish that maybe we could not necessarily go into like daytime, because obviously Batman doesn't operate that way, but I kind of wish that there was a way to change the cloudiness so that you can actually see the moon, you can actually see a little bit of the stars, the lights of the city will kind of illuminate it a little bit better and not be in a complete haze because of the rain. And then furthermore, something that is a little less diegetic, being able to turn off a little bit of the film grain, because I noticed that that's an aesthetic choice that they opted in for, but there's still a part of me that kind of at least respects that modern games lets you toggle the film grain, and unfortunately Arkham Knight doesn't let you do that. In that same vein, the sound design behind this game is also still very immaculate. There's this very clean level of polish to the way that everything just sounds that, much like the visuals, make you feel like you're actually embedded into Gotham, as far as, like I mentioned, the rain pattering on his suit and on the cape, hearing the distances in the background where I actually feel like there's an environment. It doesn't sound like all dead and quiet. I can actually hear cars kind of crashing in the distance. Of course, you're going to have your banter between the bad guys through the comms, but at the same time, you feel and even hear a little bit of the air kind of washing in between the buildings when you're a little bit high above, or when you're down at street level and you kind of hear fire from a car that's set ablaze, or debris and trash just kind of blowing off in the distance amongst the concrete. So many different factors that you could tell that Rocksteady was just honed in and focused on making sure that all the technical aspects about this game were still coming through on all different sensory levels. And that goes almost double for all of the stuff that involves anything that's like gadget or vehicle related. Say what you want about the Batmobile, but every time you hear that thing rev up, being called upon with that little ching when you hit the bumper button and you hear it coming across, or whenever it's activating tank mode and you have guns from either the bad guys or the turret from the 60mm cannon from the Batmobile and you hear it launch, all those different like sound effects and the rev ups and things like that, it's just pure joy to listen to. Except for one thing that I personally didn't think aged well. This could be a bit of a hot take, but I honestly don't like the punch effects in the game. All of the sound design behind Batman Arkham Knight is immaculate, except the punch effects. I don't know what it is, but they just ring very hollow to me. I kind of prefer those coming out of Arkham City and Arkham Knight because I feel like they're much more. They felt much more impactful. They made me feel like I was actually landing a hit on flesh towards the bad guys. Whereas here, even prior to upgrading his suit to the much more armorized mech, version 8.04, whatever it's called, the new Arkham Knight suit, something still feels like it's empty and sort of hollowed out inside every time he lands a punch for some reason in Arkham Knight. And I just don't think that aged well in the 10 years past. And I remember making a note of it when I first played the game back in 2015, and it still rings true today. But there's one sound that will never get old, and that's going to be able to hear the late and always great Kevin Conroy voice Batman. Even here, after, what are we talking about now? I think at the time it was 25 years since he first donned the cowl in his first episode of Batman the Animated Series and all the different projects, including the video game Sense. He still had it in 2015. You can maybe hear a little bit of the age in his voice, especially when he kind of drops an octave to get a little bit sentimental with emotion and kind of talking to some of his comrades. But it's still ASMR inducing. Like, if there was one thing that I'm able to take ASMR of, it would be Kevin Conroy voicing Batman. I hate ASMR, but I would do it for listening to Kevin Conroy pull off Batman lines endlessly, donning the cowl of Bruce Wayne / Batman. And the Arkham games are a great representation of that because he strikes that perfect balance of going for like a deep but also very polished voice, while at the same time bringing in a little bit of that charismatic tenor that he had in Batman the Animated Series, because he was a little bit smokier or hazier when he was doing Batman in Animated Series, but he goes for something slightly different but also somewhat familiar with the Arkham series, and it still has not aged terribly. It's like fine wine here with Arkham Knight. And likewise to, of course, the great Mark Hamill as the Joker. He's still top notch, not taking anything away from him. But also some people that are technically new-ish to Arkham Knight, one of which is most definitely new, even though we've seen his character before. But John Noble taking over for Scarecrow, because he's meant to be delivering this much more malevolent and very like dry and very like stringy sort of style to his voice, as opposed to the very like somewhat cartoonish, warped voice that he had going on in Arkham Asylum. Even though this is still lore-wise canonically still the same version of that Scarecrow, because he calls attention to the fact that he was left for dead. He's got the brace on his leg from when he was mauled by Killer Croc. So it's supposed to be the same character, but he's now got a completely different voice. Nevertheless, though, John Noble's voice definitely matches that of this portrayal of Scarecrow very eloquently. And Troy Baker pulling double, maybe even triple duty somewhat here in Arkham Knight, both as Two-Face and as well as, of course, the main antagonist, Arkham Knight. It's Troy Baker, what can you say? But at least you're able to deduce that these are two different characters that he's portraying, along with, of course, plenty of other veterans of the voice acting industry. Nolan North, of course, Tara Strong as Harley Quinn. And then you have, again, another newish voice, something similar to what they did with Scarecrow, Jonathan Banks taking over for Commissioner Gordon. Again, his voice is perfect for Gordon, but it also does bring up a slight little nitpick that I did kind of pick up on just a little bit here with Arkham Knight 10 years on, was that ever so often you do have these characters, despite pulling in great work as far as their actual delivery and energy to the character, there are times where they did feel what I like to call a little boothy. They did feel like they were in boots and not really acting with the other character that they're sharing the screen with. And I understand that that's very staple for voice actors to do, but at the same time, with modern motion capture technology, especially some of which was still being implemented in 2015. I mean, this is 2015, just a couple of years after The Last of Us, that showed us that they are on stage acting with each other. And a little bit bummed that they weren't able to somewhat do that a little bit here with Arkham Knight. I'm not expecting Kevin Conroy and Mark Hamill at their age to be donning motion capture suits, but at least harken it back to how animated series and even Spider-Man the Animated Series were recorded, where they're in boots, but they're there at the same time looking at each other from like through the windows so that they can feed off each other's energy and bounce off each other, and I sometimes felt like that wasn't present here with some of the characters. And I was almost about to say a similar thing in regards to the character design changes, because it isn't just the voice that was changed up for Gordon here with Jonathan Banks, or Scarecrow for that matter. It's also their character designs. They look almost completely different than what they did in Asylum, but they're not the only ones. Batman himself has a bit of a restructured model to his character face. Joker as well, he looks like he's been a little softened up, and of course you have a couple of other characters that look completely different than what they did in Asylum or even City. Poison Ivy for that matter, that's literally another character. I'm sorry, that's just now green with leaves and scantily clad outfit. But it's a completely different face model, and you can maybe attribute that to maybe the new engine that they were utilizing for that generation of hardware, PS4 and Xbox One, as opposed to PS3 and 360. But at the same time, I remember feeling kind of disjointed a little bit in 2015. Thankfully, here in 2025, I warmed up to those new character designs a little bit more fondly. So it's pretty easy to see that so many technical facets about the game, both visually and audibly, aged fairly well, at least the majority of them. But has the gameplay, at the end of the day, aged just as well? I would argue that, yes, the game still feels very polished and well and top-notch as far as all the different pillars that make up being Batman, which I've already kind of hammered across a number of times with my 15-year retrospective of Arkham Asylum last year. Earlier this year, I tackled Arkham City by comparing it to Asylum and why it is that I somewhat prefer Asylum over City in terms of some of the more nuanced elements that I end up in the minority of. But Arkham Knight, because of its new engine and with its level of polish, is still able to deliver a very complete experience in regards to the arsenal that you have at your disposal as Batman. You truly still feel like being the Batman in regards to gliding across the city, ziplining, doing the Predator takedowns with hiding in plain sight versus utilizing the grates. And of course, in terms of the combat, despite how slightly cartoonish and off-putting it may seem to see Batman leap from one side of the environment to the other because you managed to hit the counter button at the right moment, it nevertheless still feels fun and satisfying, and I still wind up walking away from these separate encounters with a grin on my face. It's probably the traversal where I have to kind of present a newfound complaint here after 10 years of the release of the game, something that I do think that I wish would have been patched in the year since. Would have to be occasional times where I just, for some reason, Batman would just not climb a certain ledge or take a little bit too long to zipline up while being shot at, where it's like he's taking his time ziplining. I would probably argue that that's somewhat the only moments that the gameplay was truly frustrating. And the only reason for why I bring that up is because there were other things that they were able to kind of take the criticisms from the previous two games and act upon them. One of which was how tanky he felt when it came to sprinting. You hold down the X button in my case, and in the prior two games, it felt like moving a tank where he would take forever to turn, and he would only be as fast as moving in a very clear, straightforward direction. They managed to tighten that up a little bit here in Arkham Knight, where it's much easier to turn even while he's sprinting, making maneuverability across rooftops a much cleaner experience. And at the same time, I will admit that at times it was frustrating to see that he was taking his time ziplining while getting shot at by enemies with weapons, or not platforming in the correct direction, or not having an explosive gel go off at the right time by clicking the analog stick like the game is telling me to do. And at times, I did think that maybe there was some kind of faulty connection between my controller or the game was bugging out. I mean, I did have at least one crash happen, even on PlayStation 5. The game still crashed, but just once, and it was literally towards the end of the game. Like, it was, doing so well, and if a crash is meant to happen, it's at the end where the environment is being fluxed and changed in a very sensical manner. But at times, I still have to tout the game for still being challenging, even on normal difficulty, and actually giving me incentive to upgrade my arsenal to make sure that I utilize my experience points wisely, especially since you are kind of cranking up the difficulty via actually wisening up your enemies in terms of having these militia officers or these bad guys having the drones, having these gadgets and these controllers that can actually suss out your detective mode, so that then you're not able to just exploit it to the point of like the prior two games. One of the things that people were criticizing with City and Asylum was that it's very easy to just kind of activate detective mode and keep it on. Well, now you get your bad guy who's actually able to tell where you're at because of how frequently you're using detective mode, and now you're limited to when you can use it, but actually makes you think of when to use it and treasure it wisely. Likewise, also being able to put up booby traps on your vantage points or flushing you out via the grates with these explosives. A lot of different little things to make these combat encounters and these predator encounters much more of a strategical approach that we never saw before in Asylum or City, that I think have aged extraordinarily well. But there's one tank-sized elephant in the room that we most definitely need to address. That goddamn Batmobile. Because it's cool that Rocksteady acted on that major complaint about Batman moving in a tank to make him a bit more maneuverable when jumping across rooftops. But what's the point in jumping across those rooftops when you have an actual physical tank to then traverse the majority of Gotham City in? And that's going to be the Batmobile. Something that was most notably absent from City and only made a couple of, cameo-like appearances in Asylum before being utilized in totality to apprehend Bane. And here it's brought as a major gameplay mechanic by Rocksteady, one of the big things that they were marketing when the game was coming out, only to then kind of, I don't want to say bait and switch, but make it just a bit more of a prevalent factor in the game than people were probably expecting it to be back in 2015. So, did it age as well as it did back in the day? I would argue that I feel about the same way. And here's how I felt about it in 2015, and arguably how I feel about it still in 2025, where the actual gameplay mechanics about the Batmobile, in regards to the physicality of it, the maneuverability, actually racing across Gotham City or going through some of these time trial based racetracks proposed by the Riddler in its basic vehicle mode, feel really, really nice. Going through some of these car chases, apprehending certain bad guys via the missile barrage, and also shoving them out of the way with that little shove mechanic by pressing the stick and the X button, and it's having it slow down in a very Burnout style, kind of reminding me of the Burnout games. So satisfying and so fun. And then when activating tank mode, it's pretty satisfying to getting out of the line of sight, tackling all these different APCs and these tanks, shooting them, blowing them to Kingdom Come, and then once you kind of built up enough energy, being able to press the square button and go, all Iron Man on them and go and tackle all the APCs and bombard them with these missile barrages all at the same time. So satisfying, so fun, sometimes very challenging and frustrating, but it all makes you just very, it activates your reactionary senses as a gamer to be like, okay, where do I move to make sure that I don't get trapped in a corner, and making sure that I can use the environment to my advantage. Especially when we're bringing in these, cat and mouse analogies. You bring on these APCs that hunt you down and can take you down with one shot, so it's up to you to kind of hide in places to come up from behind and hit their weak spots. But notice throughout that entire rant, I made so many references to other properties. I mentioned Iron Man, I mentioned Burnout, because that's the biggest problem with the Batmobile. It's in the wrong game. That was my problem with the goddamn Batmobile back in the day, and it's still my problem now, where the actual mechanics, the actual Batmobile and how it plays, and the physics at play when you're racing through Gotham City or activating tank mode and, doing this whole like barrage thing and shooting at each other and kind of moving out of the way, it feels good. It's great. It's just not in the right game. It doesn't feel Batman. I definitely don't become Batman when this happens. It's the least Batman thing possible. And it only just makes me wonder what it would be like if maybe Rocksteady would have taken what they learned from their experiences developing this system behind the Batmobile and maybe incorporating it into a different game. I get the strongest feeling we're probably not going to be seeing that anytime soon. And while we're on the subject of things not belonging, there's also things that are absent from Arkham Knight that I think should have belonged in there. And his name is Paul Dini. You can most notably tell exactly where you can kind of pinpoint the absence of Paul Dini. As soon as the game takes on a much more grounded and very militaristic approach with the inclusion of the militia, of course, the introduction of our main antagonist, secret antagonist, the Arkham Knight, down to even a little bit of the musical composition. Nick Arundel does return, but he's joined by David Buckley, and you can kind of tell where the score jumps between Nick Arundel and David Buckley, and whose piece of music belongs to who. Which one reminds you of the Arkhamverse, and then which one sounds like your generic like that with, like, you know, weapons and technology and holograms and, you know, targeting my location like that. Like, it doesn't, you know, it's one of the things to where the personality from the prior two Arkham games starts to get a little bit stripped away as the more of the militia is kind of fed into you with all these different, like I said, holograms and lasers and drones that you have to take out and all this stuff that feels, like I said, very militaristic style. And I'm almost certain that that's something that Paul Dini probably wouldn't have approved of should he have been still one of the core writers. But unfortunately, he did depart. And you could feel that absence jumping from Arkham City to Arkham Knight. And you could almost theorize that this is probably the explanation as to why Arkham Knight ends up being the only title in the series to be rated M, as opposed to Arkham City and Arkham Asylum, which were rated teen. And you could argue it's M-rated, you know, there's no gore, there's no bloody violence or anything like that, nothing too exaggerated, but it does go in directions in terms of tone that feel a little uncharacteristic that you would accustomed to versus the prior two games, where you have a lot of characters killing themselves on screen, a lot of shots to the head with bloody wounds and stuff like that. Again, tamed by some other standards of some other gore games like Mortal Kombat or whatever, but something that I think Paul Dini knew when to imply versus actually show on screen, and I feel like he might have had a little bit of a hand in that. It's not necessarily something that aged badly or greatly, but it's just something that I think has become a little bit of a talking point in the conversation. And in regards to how the story is written, that's another thing that is probably indicative of Dini's departure, is the pacing of the story. Something that I wanted to sort of observe a bit more closely by taking a different approach of this new playthrough versus the way that I played it back in 2015. When I played it back then, I played it like I do a general open world game where I do a little bit of main story, a little bit of side quest, a little bit of collectathon, and I just balance my time with the game going back and forth between these three pillars. This time I told myself, let me digest the story from beginning to end as closely tight-knit as possible. So I played the story and the story main story alone completely without doing any of the side stuff from beginning to end. I think a couple of times I came across some of the mutilated victims because I heard the music and I didn't want to bypass that. But overall, I just did the main story only to see exactly if I felt a little bit differently now versus 10 years ago. And the pacing of the story does still feel a little bit grinded down towards the latter part of the second act. Overall, it was actually doing a good job of kind of giving us the stakes being elevated by Scarecrow threatening to unleash this cloudburst thing and pulling down Gotham to the depths of fear, while at the same time the Arkham Knight being his second-hand man who's got a personal vendetta against Batman. That whole mystery tug and pull was still at play. But as soon as the Joker stuff comes in is where I do think that the game story grinds to a halt that I just don't think has aged very well 10 years later. Specifically, not so much with Joker being implanted back into Batman's brain, because it does kind of make sense that Batman would be struggling with portions of the Joker personality from the fallout of Arkham City, from his death to a little bit of that was injected in him, even though he technically cured himself at the end of Arkham City. So that kind of lends to a little bit of a plot hole that I do think raises more questions than poses answers, and may not have aged all too well a decade on. But my main problem from a pacing and writing standpoint is when the game comes to a halt to apprehend these other people that were incorporated with the Joker blood that are now turning into Jokers. So the big fighter, the big burly guy, the stand-up comedian, and the office assistant, all culminating with, of course, Henry Adams, who Batman perceived to have been immune, only to realize that he's wrong. When we get to this part of the story, I started to feel like kind of impatient. Like I just felt like I just wanted this thing to hurry along, and I'm over here thinking, a Rocksteady Batman game, and I'm waiting for a moment in the story to just kind of speed along and get past so that we can get to some of the good juicy stuff, even if it's some of the juicy stuff that, again, wasn't necessarily one of the greatest highlights of the game, which is, of course, the Jason Todd reveal, which still didn't work despite the heavy hinting from the torture scenes and all these different factors that I'm looking at this Joker part and I'm like, yeah, this didn't age well. And speaking of Joker the Torturer, let's address his return. Let's address this somewhat little corner that the writers painted themselves in by killing off Joker at the end of Arkham City. A very bold move that led to a very captivating climax to point off, to kind of cap off and round out what a lot of people argue, not just one of the best Batman games ever made, but probably one of the better Batman stories ever told through that medium. I'll admit it still feels a little bit like a betrayal to that ending by bringing back Mark Hamill's Joker in this game, considering that we really did feel like that there was a sense of finality. And to confirm that finality by burning his body at the beginning of this game, I remember back in 2015 thinking that that was kind of neat, only to then realize that he's brought back as a hallucination inside of Bruce's mind via the activation of the Scarecrow toxin inside of that scene where he's trying to replace the canisters. Again, lends to a bit of a plot hole because we all thought that he had already cured himself at the end of Arkham City, unless I'm completely overlooking something. But it's probably the lesser of the evils that Rocksteady could have acted upon to bring him back by still keeping him dead, while at the same time still incorporating him Fight Club style in this game. And it does lead to some interesting avenues and some positives to walk away with. One of which I've already hinted on, which is that Mark Hamill is still killing it, no pun intended, as the Joker with his one-liners, some of which I gotta be honest, I don't think I've ever heard before. I don't know if they were patched in. Maybe they were patched in after the fact, after I played it back in 2015, or maybe they were always there, but different circumstances in the game's storyline then prompted them to actually be used by the Joker in regards to certain characters doing certain things, especially because of the way that I played it this time around. And so he was still able to get good laughs out of me. He's still very compelling. His Joker, along with Conroy's Batman, still have great chemistry with one another as both hero and villain. And then the battle for Batman's mind that culminates there in the final act, despite again still having that little bit of kind of a cop-out to Arkham City's ending, it's still a very enthralling concept to see that Joker can still have some sort of influence on Batman's brain even after the mortal realm. Something that I think comes close to this game tackling the Batman Who Laughs storyline. And it also shows off some of the strengths that Rocksteady had in the horror genre when we jump into that stuff inside of Batman's brain by revisiting Crime Alley, going through these different things that were kind of planted there from Arkham Asylum, where we have that glitch sequence where now you're walking as the Joker and Batman is apprehended. You have different things that are playing around with reality that is really, really good to see. And to me, one of the big ones that still 10 years later, I saw pop up on my screen as a cutscene, and I still kind of felt impressed with my eyes peeling back, is where he's on the airship. Joker takes over for a little bit. He lets him through for a little bit, and you have Batman going like, wow, look at this body, with Joker's voice, and I'm over here like, yo, that's the stuff that generally did work in regards to this concept. And again, sort of giving us a glimpse into the mind trap sequence there at the end with him walking through Batman's mind, and now you're in control of the Joker with this gun. Not only is it a cool concept to show how much of everything is kind of push and pull between those two characters, but at the same time, it's also leaning towards what it would have been like if Rocksteady were to do a horror game. Just imagine a horror game with the whole, thing that is very reminiscent of something like Silent Hill, where Joker moves in one direction and then when he looks back there's a Batman statue just standing there. It's legitimately creepy 10 years later, and I still get creeped out by that sequence, and I'm over here thinking, take away the license and how badass it would have been if Rocksteady were to do a really well polished horror game. Or if you're not doing a horror game, there were some actually neat mechanics both in the first person and third person sense by controlling Joker with that gun. I wonder if it's possible that maybe Rocksteady could do some kind of like third-person show. Oh God! No. I take it back. I take it back. Let's just say that everything just ended the way it definitively did here by having Batman lock away Joker deep in his mind, represented beautifully with that thing that he throws away with his eye turning from green back to blue, apprehending Scarecrow and telling Alfred that he's gonna have to activate the Nightfall Protocol, but not before apprehending more of the criminals running amok in Gotham City, which then leads me to a very interesting part of my playthrough in this 10-year retrospective, 10 years looking back, which is now doing the side content that I've been kind of pushing off to the side while tackling the main story, which did have some interesting effects. First, much like the main story, it did kind of point out a couple of pacing issues with some of these side pieces, side quests, some of which I can kind of forgive because you can tell that they were simply just trying to do justice to incorporating some characters that would make sense for them to do the things that they do within Gotham City when things are going into chaos. But at the same time, I wish that they would have been played around with a little bit more, like Two-Face and Penguin just, doing the same thing over and over, all culminating in one final fight or one final blowout that just happens to include Penguin and Two-Face, but not much of the dynamics really changed. It kind of had a bit of a tacked on approach to them, if I'm being quite honest. You could almost say double of that for the Deacon Blackfire side quest, which is literally just one thing that you have to do: apprehend him, take out his followers, and bring Jack Ryder back to the GCPD. Why was that here? However, chasing down Firefly and then finally apprehending Hush in a very dramatic style had like this kind of cinematic flair that I really did appreciate. And since the game is taking place in All Hallows Eve, it only makes sense to include some very horror-based side missions or villains that you have to apprehend that definitely lend an awful lot to the creep factor, specifically Professor Pig. The little snorting sound effects that he did, I wholeheartedly welcomed his inclusion in this game. And harkening back to the very first episode of the animated series, we got Man-Bat in here, which of course has a very creature feature approach to his character, especially because of his tragic backstory. Only this time, did not get the jump scare. I actually was able to tackle Man-Bat from the air down to the ground before he was able to jump scare me. Ha! And then Azrael is simply just cool. I always thought that Azrael was pretty badass looking, so it's cool to see that he kind of has like this Assassin's Creed sort of approach to his character, and even Batman's doing a little bit of that recon sort of approach to his background story with like his memories. It kind of reminded me a little bit of the Abstergo stuff from the earlier Assassin's Creed games. Unfortunately, didn't come close to ever tackling Deathstroke because that involves taking down the militia, which requires so much of the busy work of taking care of the towers, the checkpoints, shutting down the APCs, the bombs, and then rescuing the firefighters, that seeing all those little arrows of how many of those things you have to do over and over to complete those side quests, I gotta be brutally honest, I don't have the time for that. That I just never felt terribly compelled, at least here at 34 years of age, 10 years from when I first played it. Things have changed, and so being able to approach that it was a little bit less digestible now as a 30-year-old gamer. And if that's the way I feel about the militia stuff, you can bet your ass that there's no way in hell I'm tackling all 200 plus Riddler trophies to bring him in. I'm sorry, Selena, you're just gonna have to wait. What I did feel compelled to do, however, was the Gotham's Most Wanted DLC missions. DLC that I think since then they've released free of charge. I think it was for like an anniversary thing or for the Switch trilogy release. And so I remember I got it as part of my collector's edition, and I think I only played like one or like played half of one because I distinctly remember tracking down Killer Croc. But I think something happened and I never got a chance to really finish any of these missions. But here, I most definitely felt more so compelled to tackle them. Effectively, though, you can kind of get the gist that these were deleted side missions that didn't make it into the final cut of the game, and now they were kind of now labeled as DLC. I'm sorry, I get that vibe. Inherently, that also means that they're also not bad. Some are going to probably perform a little bit better than others, and depending on the player, they're going to get preferred by some gamers more so than others. I thought that the Mad Hatter one was, again, kind of reminiscing a little bit of what I complained about the Two-Face and Penguin missions, where I felt like I was doing the same thing like 3 times, and then finally it caps off on something. Only this time they got a little bit creative with the jump to Wonderland via the little pop-up storybook. I did appreciate that. But then you have a couple of others that had a few of their problems. The Mr. Freeze one, it was very cool to see that Nora finally had a say in her predicament. Only, despite the cathartic ending to that side quest, I felt like it was still a little bit lacking in depth as far as gameplay was concerned in regards to like the stealth missions. They felt like just more malicious stealth missions. And then you also had Killer Croc, which really could have been an excellent scary mission to track down Croc inside of that airship, only for them to tell me to leave the airship to go track down these two other guys. So I'm like, well, there goes the horror element, because now I'm leaving, only to come back and do another like duel fight with Killer Croc the way that I was fighting the big guy, the big Jokerized guy inside of that drag down segment. So here we are doing this again, only with a Croc coat of paint. Which then leads me to, I guess you could argue, my favorite out of these 4 Gotham Most Wanted missions, which was the Ra's al Ghul one, because it was cool to see that we finally got a bit of a resolution to the Ra's al Ghul story arc from Arkham City. But likewise, I thought it was pretty compelling to see that there was a civil war brewing within the League, one that wants to go against Ra's, led by Cinna, I think was her name. I could be butchering her name, but basically Talia's sister. So it's cool that there were some loose ends tied up in that regard that is also personally connected to Bruce, and he has a bit of a stake in all this. So I think that resonated with me a little bit more strongly, and also gave me some cool fights against these ninjas that had a really cool parry mechanic that felt pretty badass to execute. Once I completed these Gotham Most Wanted missions, that was, I think, in my opinion, the really ripe moment to finally activate the Nightfall Protocol, go back to Wayne Manor, and execute the ending. Of course, this is not the complete ending, since I didn't apprehend all the bad guys in Gotham City to get that 100% completion, but there's always YouTube to be able to satisfy us with that extra little bit of cutscene. The only thing that I can say, though, is that now looking back at this game 10 years, it is very difficult to ignore the level of polish, ambition, presentation, and talent that Rocksteady, at the time of this game's release, 2015, was able to execute with this Arkham trilogy. Sure, there were corners that they painted themselves at that led to some gaping flaws in either the marketing or the execution of some ideas in regards to the titular Arkham Knight, the way that Joker was sort of retconish brought back into the fold here despite his death at the end of Arkham City. But there were a lot of other compromises that they were able to make to then make sure that they got somewhat the best of both worlds in that regard. Even if it led to something that, again, felt a bit more on the technical showcase side of things, with the implementation of the weather mechanics, the Batmobile in and of itself completely being out of tone with the rest of the game. But as an overall package to end the Arkham trilogy, I'd say that 10 years looking back, this is probably the best that they could have achieved, and they nailed it. And if history has shown us something, is that it's pretty difficult to nail the ending of a trilogy. And it looks like Batman takes a bit of a brunt of it back in the 2010s, first with The Dark Knight Rises, and now with Batman Arkham Knight. But considering the departure of one of your lead writers in the form of Paul Dini, and the elements that they had to work with the team that was still on board over at Rocksteady at the time, I think that they were able to achieve something that was ultimately, flaws and all, still satisfying, and replaying it 10 years later, I truly do feel like Rocksteady was still able to let me be the Batman. So with the 10-year anniversary of Batman Arkham Knight, please let me know down in the comment section. Do you guys like the game better? Do you like it worse? Do you think that some things have aged much better than others have perceived them to be? Or do you think there's some things that have somewhat rotted from the inside that you think could have been executed a whole lot better? And is there something within this game that speaks to you a little bit differently than the other 2 entries in the Arkham trilogy from Rocksteady? Because as we leave All Hallows Eve month, Christmas is just around the corner. And you know what that means? It means that Joker has a few gifts waiting for us underneath the tree. And one of those gifts is in the form of a potential revisit to the red-headed stepson that is known as WB Montreal's Batman Arkham Origins. I'll see you guys then.